this is America, and this is where Donald Trump lives and where he's been selling victory in the war with Iran, even as a fragile ceasefire draws to a close. But is the US public really buying that? And will they continue to do so if this conflict, which he said would be over in 6 weeks, continues to go on and on? I'll have more on that coming up, but first, here's Cyril Vanier in our Washington studio.
And John Holman there. Thank you very much, John. The U.S. president says that it is only a matter of time before Iran makes a deal on his terms, one that Donald Trump can present to the American public as a clear victory. But promising a victory that hasn't materialized and then doubling down on that promise also comes with risks.
Thanks to the progress we've made, I can say tonight that we are on track to complete all of America's military objectives shortly. It'll be wrapped up soon. We're going to have a much safer world. Their Navy's gone, their Air Force is gone, their anti-aircraft is all gone, it's all gone, their radar is all gone, their leaders are all gone. We're going to have victory very shortly. I think it's close to over, yeah. I view it as very close to over.
So in a moment, we'll be speaking to Mike Hanna about the thinking inside the White House. Then we'll be asking what would actually constitute victory for the United States, what the U.S. needs to achieve in Iran and the wider Middle East to bolster the president's case that this costly war has made Americans safer or otherwise work to their benefit. Well, President Donald Trump's rhetoric is clear that the war is a success and the U.S. is rapidly meeting its objectives. But the president also has a history of making statements that don't reflect the reality on the ground. Trump repeatedly said that Iran was on the verge of developing a nuclear weapon. He also said that he launched the war because Iran posed an imminent threat. Well, the U.S. intelligence analysts contradicted him, saying that Tehran was not, in fact, building nuclear arms. In early April, Trump said the U.S. had already met its military objectives in the war. His Secretary of Defense added that Iran's military has been decimated and rendered combat ineffective for years to come. But Iran has demonstrated that it still maintains missile and drone capabilities, even though they have sustained extensive damage. And it still has its enriched uranium stockpiles. Trump says the U.S. plans to take those. Al Jazeera's Mike Hanna is live at the White House. Mike, how does the president reconcile his promises of a swift victory at the start of the war with where we are now?
Well, he does so by continuing to insist that there's already been a victory despite all the evidence to the contrary. From the moment this conflict began, President Trump has had shifting timelines about how long this conflict is going to last. Initially, he was saying it was a matter of days, then it became a matter of weeks, not more than 3 weeks, then 5 weeks. And then, of course, what we've had in recent days, that one word, soon. Soon has been repeated many times by President Trump with reference to when this conflict is going to end or when President Trump intends it to end. So there are these shifting timelines. There is this lack of clarity as to exactly what the status of this conflict is. And given the fact that there are these shifting timelines, one raises the question whether there was any timeline at all from the beginning of this conflict, whether indeed the end game had been thought through before the conflict began. So these are questions that many within the American public are asking. Why start a war when you do not know how it's going to end and you do not have an off-ramp in order to end it? President Trump now continuing to try and build an off-ramp, insisting that talks will take place, insisting that he believes that these negotiations will be successful. This despite, once again, all evidence to the contrary.
Al Jazeera's Mike Hanna reporting live from the White House. Thank you very much, Mike. And the White House is holding firm that the pressure campaign against Iran is working and that a deal is within reach. Manuel Rapallo has more.
After almost 2 months of war, President Donald Trump has doubled down that U.S. military force has put Washington on the brink of a deal with Iran.
They have no Navy, they have no Air Force, they have no leaders, they have no nothing. Actually, their leaders it is regime change. You call that enforced regime change. The USA will get all nuclear dust.
In speech after speech,
we will make America powerful again.
Trump has argued the U.S. has already achieved its core objectives, crippling Iran's nuclear program, degrading its missile capabilities, and striking its military infrastructure. Across the administration, that message is echoed. A deal, and by extension, a U.S. victory, is seen within reach.
Nothing is official until you hear it from us here at the White House, but we feel good about the prospects of a deal.
But there is an alternative. As our negotiators have said, you, Iran, can choose a prosperous future, a golden bridge. And we hope that you do for the people of Iran.
Thank you very much.
The White House narrative is one of control, economic pressure, military dominance, and momentum. But outside the briefing rooms, the picture begins to blur. Thousands have been killed since the joint U.S.-Israeli strikes began on Iran almost 2 months ago. Still, there's been no surrender, no sweeping concessions, and no clear sign that Tehran is ready to fold. And U.S. intelligence assessments have suggested that despite the U.S. strikes, Iran's leadership structure remains intact and may even be hardening, with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps exerting greater control. Over the weekend, Iranian officials said they would not be joining a new round of talks with Washington, as both sides continue to apply pressure in the Strait of Hormuz. The Trump administration insists that its pressure tactics are delivering results and that a victory is close. But the version of success being sold here in Washington does not fully match with what we're seeing play out in reality. For now, the U.S. is projecting strength, as Iran is projecting resistance. Meanwhile, the gap between those two narratives is growing. So while President Trump continues framing the conflict as a U.S. victory, uncertainty looms over what that victory actually looks like and whether it materializes at all. Manuel Rapalo, Al Jazeera, Washington.
So let's pick up on the back of that question. What could victory actually look like for the United States, assuming victory even happens? We're joined in the studio by former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Arabian Peninsula Affairs. That's Danielle Benaim. Good to have you with us. Former senior U.S. diplomat and former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary for Levant Affairs, Joe Rayburn, also with us. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Danielle Benaim, you were an advisor to President Biden. You were also an advisor to Vice President Biden, also an advisor to the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton. What would be the very minimum level of diplomatic or military achievement that Donald Trump needs to get to right now to be able to walk away and say he has won the war, or the U.S. has won the war?
I think the off-ramps from this journey where the U.S. could say that they outright won the war were probably far earlier and we didn't take them. We're now in a very complicated military engagement with Iran and a very complicated diplomatic engagement. And I think you have to go back and look at the goals for this war from the outset. They were never articulated in one place very clearly, but we talked about restraining Iran's nuclear program in an authoritative way over a long period of time. Arguably, some of that could have been done without a war. We talked about addressing Iran's missile stockpiles so that it can't threaten the region and the world. I think that has happened to some extent, although a lot of those missiles remain. And Iran has found a new way to threaten the region and the world by closing the Strait of Hormuz in a way that wasn't even really palpably clear before this war. They talked about an Iranian regime change. And in some ways, the Iranian regime has changed in the sense that it's the same regime with different people. But in some cases, those people are less amenable.
That's not what most people would define as regime change.
That's right. And then I think what most people hoped regime change would do would be unleash the talents of the Iranian people. And so we haven't seen that. So on all of those goals, we're pretty far behind where we started this war. But I think the key question is, what can we get through diplomacy or otherwise to advance U.S. interests here? And I think the absolute pass-fail test at the start of this is, can you reopen the Strait of Hormuz for commercial traffic to get that blood pumping to the U.S., to the world economy through those waters and get those ships moving? The second test that I think is important, in part because the administration made it very important, even though Iran wasn't currently enriching since the bombing of last June, would be to come to some kind of understanding that prevents Iran from racing for a bomb and puts many, many years on the clock of verifiable restrictions for the Iranian nuclear program. And then I think beyond that, there are other things that the United States would certainly like to see, and there are a bunch of things that Iran would like to see. But the United States and Israel and others may have to live to fight another day.
Joe Rayburn, you've been involved in the major conflicts that the U.S. has fought the last, 3 decades? Iraq, Afghanistan.
Yugoslavia.
Okay, I didn't know about that one. You've been in the field, you've been an intelligence analyst, and you've been a political advisor and also involved in diplomacy. So you check all the boxes. When you look at the situation here, what constitutes success and victory from your point of view? Because I imagine it could be very different for a military man.
Well, so on a military level, the Iranian regime has been dramatically weakened, operationally speaking. I mean, it happens to be that the ceasefire has sort of put the military campaign on hold. But when you're in a situation where the Iranian regime doesn't control its own airspace, the Israeli Air Force, the U.S. Air Force is flying over all parts of Iran, able to strike anything they want to at pretty much any time, that's a militarily unsustainable situation for the Iranian regime to be in.
U.S. war jets being shot down, notwithstanding.
Well, now, so, I mean, we don't know the exact tally, but probably over 13,000 sorties flown into Iranian airspace with 2 aircraft shot down by probably a shoulder-fired system. So, I mean, compare that to any other air campaign we've had. I think the air planners, if you told them that at the outset, you're going to do that many sorties and only lose 2 aircraft to hostile fire and no crews, I think they would have said, no, that's not possible. So, but that's the military mismatch. Now, if it comes to a confrontation in the Strait of Hormuz, I think you see a similar military mismatch. CENTCOM, even before the ceasefire, CENTCOM was strafing the littoral region, the coast there, for at least 3 weeks, basically pushing back all the assets that the Iranians could use, destroying their bases and so on. It'd be very difficult for the Iranians to actually enforce the closure of the Strait of Hormuz if CENTCOM chooses to try to force it open.
But they've just enforced it over the last 48 hours.
No, not really.
They opened fire on ships, so ships had to turn back.
Yeah, that was the ships unescorted. I mean, this is a confrontation. This is an untested proposition. Does the Iranian regime have the military means to be able to enforce the closure of the Strait of Hormuz against the U.S. Navy and against the U.S. Air Force? It's an untested proposition. Just looking at the mismatch in all other aspects of the war and what assets they probably still have available, I think the answer is probably no. I think the CENTCOM planners probably agree with me. So
but the ships going through the Strait don't agree with you, right? Because they're not going through the Strait.
Those are commercial ships that are unescorted. But on the day that of the first Islamabad talks, there were 2 U.S. destroyers transited the Gulf one way, turned around and transited back unmolested. So I think
Iran disagrees with that narrative. They have their own narrative, but carry on.
Yeah, I mean, it's very clear. Either they did not have the ability to stop those destroyers from going through the Gulf, or they were afraid to. Both of them amount to the same thing in the end. So there's a 3rd U.S. carrier strike group en route to the region. By the time that gets there, for sure, there would be the naval assets, I think military experts would tell you, to be able to force the Strait and enforce a blockade of all of the Iranian ports. Now, the difficulty comes in translating that military advantage into your political objectives. So in that case, wider things play in. The world economy, political pressures, both international pressures, domestic pressures, and all that. How President Trump and his cabinet will decide according to that calculus, I don't know. But just in strict military terms, the negotiators are sitting on one side of the table, have the decisive military advantage if they choose to use it. Let's say they return to hostilities, not to belabor this point, let's say they return to the hostilities. The U.S. side, the Israeli side together can go far up the escalation ladder beyond where the Iranians are able to go.
Yeah, but the question that we're asking today is what actually constitutes a win? And so what you're telling us is that the U.S. and Israel have the ability and have vastly degraded Iran's military capabilities. But you're also yourself pointing out that this may not actually constitute a win when you turn back and try to sell this to the American audience.
Yeah, there may be other factors that cause the administration to stop short of what their military leverage could likely get them if they were to continue. This is true.
Daniel Ben-Naim, how do presidents, secretaries of state, vice presidents weigh this? In other words, what their military people are telling them of what may or may not have been achieved on the ground versus how they are then, especially in an election year, going to be able to package it for the American voters?
You know, I think if you're the president, or the vice president or the chief of staff, you're among the only people who really have these jobs that kind of cut all the way across the panoply from how do we end this war in a way that meets the national interests of the United States, and what's the price of a gallon of gas, and what does this mean for the midterm elections? And I think that, you know, David Petraeus, among others, have talked about the fact that the center of gravity,
whom Joel Rayburn advised,
exactly, for the center of gravity for an effort like this one of the key centers of gravity is the public opinion of the state that has to conduct this war over time. And so I think they are looking at public opinion. They are looking at macroeconomic indicators. They're trying, and President Trump is trying to talk down the markets. Every Friday afternoon, there seems to be great news that comes out to kind of help the markets close at a sustainable level. And then something seems to go wrong on a Sunday, in part to create enough time and space politically and economically, which are tightly enmeshed, to do whatever they want to do militarily or diplomatically. But I do think that they're concerned. It's already, you're already in April. We're increasingly, the further we get along this year, the closer any disruptions to the macroeconomic picture in the United States get to those midterm elections. So
yeah, 6 months from now.
Exactly. I think while President Trump really wants to see this war to a satisfactory conclusion insofar as he can, I think he's got to have one eye on the calendar.
Let's take a quick look at how this is being portrayed across the U.S. media landscape. Also, how Americans currently feel, according to the latest poll numbers, about this war. John Holman has been looking at this.
So as we head into the last 2 days of a fragile ceasefire and stalled peace talks, is the US winning this war or even bossing the negotiations? President Trump's doing what he can to shape the story into a yes, making impromptu calls to reporters across the spectrum. On Sunday, it was the turn of Trey Yingst of Fox News, one of the most Trump-friendly outlets. He explained the conversation he'd had.
Good morning. I just spoke with President Trump for about 20 minutes, and he told me if Iran does not sign this deal, the whole country is getting blown up. The president told me this tough talk is the only thing the Iranians understand. They don't understand the traditional diplomacy and dialogue of the region. They understand firepower, the firepower that belongs to the United States military.
So Trump there is the master negotiator playing hardball. But the Saturday night panelist for Fox News competitor, leftist CNN, saw things differently.
I want Donald Trump to succeed in ending this war, but I can't ignore the incompetence in which he's prosecuting that negotiation, because it's obvious. And the way that we know they don't have a strategy is because the strategy changes every day.
The Wall Street Journal, a conservative outlet, but often critical of Trump, took things further with a behind-the-curtains look at a president who they said is dealing with doubts himself. Here's the headline. Behind Trump's public bravado on the war, he grapples with his own fears. It goes on to say that Trump's veering between belligerent and conciliatory approaches and grappling behind the scenes with just how badly things could go wrong. The article also says that some of his more out there messages threatening Iran are actually staged. He said he wanted to seem as unstable and insulting as possible, believing it could bring the Iranians to the table, administration officials reportedly told the Journal. It was a language, he said, the Iranians would understand. But what does the US public think? Is Trump leading the country to victory or into a long, drawn-out mess? Well, there's a new poll from NBC News, who are usually pretty critical of Trump. It shows that 67% of Americans disapprove of his handling of the war. NBC says that according to their polling, that's the lowest job rating for Trump yet in his second term. As he goes into the crunch point of this ceasefire, there's a lot on the line for Iran, the US, and for this presidency.
Okay, gentlemen, you both worked for the last two administrations. You worked with the Trump administration in his first term, Joel, and Daniel, you worked, as we said, with President Biden, and before that when he was vice president. I'd like to ask you both the same question. If you were advising the president in this moment, and we've established that all presidents are always balancing their political needs, how they're going to sell this to the public, versus what they're actually doing on the ground, how the war is actually going and how it's being prosecuted. what would you advise them? What would you tell them to do now based on where we are in this war against Iran, Joel?
Yeah, I think look, if you look at the polling among the president's Republican base, and especially the self-identified MAGA constituency, the support is overwhelmingly positive for the president on the Iran war approach. So I think he doesn't have to worry about his own base for the time being. The midterms are quite some time off. So
but the base is not enough, by the way.
Sorry?
The base isn't quite enough, right? If he wants to hang on to a majority in the midterms.
It's enough. I mean, midterms. I'm not a political commentary expert, but I mean, midterms tend to be about enthusiasm in your own base and turnout among the base. But I think that he has some time politically speaking. He's got a military advantage. If I were advising him, I would say press the military advantage. Americans don't like warfare, but they like a winner. So there are some achievable objectives here. I think you could impose some terms on the Iranian regime related to the threats that we identified at the outset of the war: the nuclear disposition of the nuclear material, missile and drone threat, financing of proxies. Those are well within reach with the military leverage that he has.
How do you impose terms? What in the last 6-7 weeks gives you confidence that if the U.S. either resumes bombing or just without resuming bombing maintains its current naval blockade, that the U.S. would achieve sometime in the next few weeks or months what it hasn't yet achieved?
Listen, what the president has been saying from time to time, warning, is the following. The Iranian regime's critical infrastructure, its electrical grid, its telecoms network, its refining capacity is undefended. That could be probably taken out by skilled targeteers in a way where you didn't permanently damage the main infrastructure. And the Iranian regime's economy would grind to a halt. If that country went dark, I think the Iranian regime would begin to have great trouble maintaining control on the ground, and that could see an unraveling.
Those things could be war crimes.
No, they're not war crimes. If dual-use infrastructure, which is supporting a military campaign, is a legitimate target under the law of war.
But bomb the power plants, make Iran go dark, which is what Trump has threatened to do.
Yes, you could do that. There's nothing that the Iranian regime can do to prevent that because they don't control their own airspace. So, I mean.
No, they can't prevent it, but my point is that it might be against international law. It might be unlawful to do those things.
It's not unlawful. Okay. Like I said, critical infrastructure that serves a dual purpose, if it's supporting a military adversary, it's a legitimate target. This is closed and shut case. So he has that escalatory option. Honestly, I suspect, having looked at the Iranian regime for quite some time, including as a CENTCOM officer, again, if the country went dark, if the regime could no longer communicate at a local level, they would begin to lose control in large swaths of the country. And that could be the unraveling of the regime. I think they know that. That's why that threat is a very potent one.
Daniel, what would you advise the president if you're in this moment now?
Well, I think we advise two very different presidents.
Sure, of course.
But the advice that I would give to any American president at this moment would be to look at this picture and say that you've achieved militarily what you can achieve militarily. Now is the time to pivot to a more flexible diplomatic approach to try to get political gains out of the military gains you've got. You're going to need to apply pressure. You're going to need to apply pressure on the Strait to keep that open, including the counter blockade that they've done. They're going to need to have the threat of the use of force on the table. But this would be a good time to lose your phone, stop issuing threats of civilizational erasure, and start looking for an actual compromise that addresses the issues and be as flexible as necessary to achieve an outcome here. Going back to war for the United States, I think regime change remains a fantasy. And while it's a fantasy that I share and would love to one day as an American have a relationship that's more direct with the people of Iran than we've been able to have and give them a direct role in ruling their country, I don't think that should be the United States policy at this moment. I think the United States policy should be to look for an end to the war that preserves U.S. interests, of which there are several vital ones on the table, including nonproliferation and the freedom of the seas.
All right, so you're saying don't go. The two of you are quite different in the approach that you would take right now. Joel Rayburn saying maybe there is more military pressure to be applied that could achieve results. You're saying don't go down that road. You've achieved what you can so far.
I also think that there are times when military pressure achieves a great deal. And I think the old saying that there's no military solution to a political problem, it's not totally true. I think last June's war actually meaningfully set back Iran's nuclear program in ways that bought a lot of time for the United States to try to find other solutions. So I think there is a role for the military instrument here. I just think that it comes at a cost, and it's achieved a great deal, and needs to be used in harmony with other tools.
Listen, thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us on the show today. As Joe Rayburn, former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary for Levant Affairs, and Danielle Benaim, former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Arabian Peninsula Affairs. Thank you very much to both of you. And the president has repeatedly claimed that he is winning or has already won the war with Iran, especially when taking to social media. Alex Baird has this roundup of how the American public has digested that victory narrative online.
The president famously hates losing, even more than he loves winning. His latest reminder of that on Instagram.
We're going to win so much, you may even get tired of winning. And you'll say, please, please, it's too much winning. We can't take it anymore.
But for some, that post over the weekend was tone deaf. Many struggling to believe this is what winning looks like, with the Strait of Hormuz still a shooting gallery and the war with no exit. Trump's victory narrative proving hard to swallow, flip-flops happening at warp speed. The Daily Show distilling that down to this.
Remember, I'm the president of peace.
Peace and war, are they really so different?
Recent polling doing the rounds online has only 15% of Americans backing Trump's victory claims, and 38% still support the strikes. Economic podcaster Peter Schiff saying that matters because Trump's diehard fans will believe the president even if he spins defeat as the greatest military victory in history. That spin being spun across social media with AI videos raking up millions and millions of views on both sides of the spectrum. Republican strategist Scott Jennings convinced that for the Democrats, Trump can never win, even if he just walked into Iran.
Do you want us to win? Do you want us to defeat these people?
I always want the U.S. to win.
Because it sounds to me like you are cheering for a bad outcome.
Fred Fleitz is the vice chairman of the American First Policy Institute, and he maintains Trump is winning, eroding Tehran's leverage despite constant media lies. Whatever side you're on, there's no denying the president's view that he's going to win so much, you're going to be so sick and tired of winning.
Alex Baird there. Well, on This Is America, we'll keep following the decisions that shape the U.S. and influence the world. For now, we'll hand right back to Al Jazeera's global headquarters in Doha. Thank you for joining us.